Achieving Success with Olivia Atkins. I'm your host, Olivia Atkins. Each week, we will discuss the roadmap of achieving your personal and professional success. In these solo episodes, I pull back the curtain on podcasting, entrepreneurship, and personal success. You will hear the strategies I use, the lessons I've learned, and the honest stories that shaped me. So you can build not just a successful podcast, but a business and life you're proud of. And today's episode is different. Not because it's heavier, not because it's dramatic, but because it's foundational. This is not an episode about doing more. It's an episode about understanding what you're already doing and the weight it carries. Today, we're talking about why podcasting is both a gift and a responsibility. There's a quote I want to start with today. With words we can inspire, and with words we can destroy. Nelson Mandela. And the reason I'm opening with this is because most people think podcasting is about having something to say. They think it's about content, about ideas, about finally sharing their thoughts with the world. But the moment you speak into a microphone, whether you're hosting a conversation or stepping into someone else's, something happens. You are invited into someone's time, their attention, their thinking, often their most private moments. And that invitation is not neutral. Podcasting is not just a platform, it's access. And access always comes with responsibility, whether we acknowledge it or not. Let's slow this down because podcasting gets talked about like it's just another content channel, another distribution method, another growth lever, another marketing tool. But podcasting does not behave like social media. People don't listen to podcasts the way they scroll a feed. They don't skim, they don't half consume, they invite you into the car with them, into the kitchen while they're cooking dinner after a hard day, into their headphones while they're walking, thinking, processing, becoming. Think about it. You're listening to me right now. What are you doing while you're listening to this episode? Podcast listeners aren't multitasking the way social media assumes. They're absorbing. They hear your tone, not just your words. They pick up on your certainty or your hesitation. They notice how you frame problems, how you talk about other people, how you talk about yourself, what you normalize and what you dismiss. Podcasting doesn't just share information, it shapes perspective. And perspective shapes decisions, often quietly, often later, often in ways you'll never fully see. That's why this matters. If you're listening to this right now, like I said earlier, maybe you're driving, maybe you're cleaning, maybe you're sitting somewhere quiet, wherever you are. Notice how different this feels from scrolling. You didn't accidentally end up here. You chose this. You chose to give your time to a voice and to me, and I appreciate that. And when someone does that with your podcast, when you choose your voice, you're not competing with content. You're becoming a presence, and presence carries weight. The gift side of podcasting. Let's talk about the gift first. Podcasting is a gift because it allows you to speak without interruption, explore ideas fully, be nuanced, be human. It allows long-form thought in a world obsessed with sound bites. It allows complexity where everything else demands simplicity. It allows truth to breathe. That's a gift. It's also a gift because it creates relationship, not consumption. Listeners don't just follow podcasts, they return to them. They build familiarity, trust, a sense of knowing you, even if you never met. That kind of trust is rare and it's powerful, which brings us to the responsibility aspect, the part most people don't think about. Here's the part most people don't consciously consider, at least when starting a podcast. Your voice becomes part of someone's internal world. It sits beside them while they think, while they're uncertain, while they're hopeful, while they're afraid, while they're deciding something about their life. And that means your words don't just land once, they echo. This is why podcasting can't be treated casually, because even when you forget what you said, someone else might still be carrying it. Intention versus impact. One of the biggest misunderstandings around responsibility is people think responsibility is all about intention. I didn't mean to. I wasn't trying to. That wasn't my goal. But responsibility isn't about what you meant. It's about what lands. And that doesn't mean you have to be perfect. No one expects you to be perfect. I'm not even perfect. And you'll hear me fumble on words in episodes and things like that. But it means you have to be intentional. And that's the difference. Most creators don't disrespect the mic, they underestimate it. They think, well, it's just my opinion. It's just a conversation I had. It's not that serious. But seriousness doesn't come from tone. It comes from impact. You can be lighthearted and still be responsible. You can be casual and still be intentional. You can be warm and still be grounded. Responsibility doesn't mean heaviness. It means awareness. I want to pause here. If you're a podcaster, if you want to start a podcast, if you guest on podcasts, ask yourself this quietly. Why do I want to be heard? Not the polished version and answer, the real one. Because whatever that answer is, it shows up in your voice. When I launched my podcast on November 1st, 2022, I didn't do it to build a second career. I wasn't chasing virality. I wasn't trying to monetize. I wasn't trying to be known. I was working a demanding full-time job at Lockheed Martin. And when I say demanding, our normal week, even though it's a 40-hour work week, was more 50 hours plus. And I was volunteering with multiple nonprofits and sitting on their boards, which meant way more extra meetings and time spent. I started the podcast because I believe deeply in using my voice to make an impact. At the time, my business attorney suggested that if I was starting a company alongside the podcast, there should be a way for it to sustain itself financially. So my salary wasn't funding what could easily become an expensive hobby. That was practical advice. I mean, career development consulting made sense. I had a published book, Achieving Success in Career Development, that you can find on my website. I was speaking at colleges, but the podcast itself, that felt different. It felt personal, purpose-driven, human. It felt like responsibility, even then, before I could name it. Here's something I want to be very clear about. Podcasting is not just about talking. It's leading. And leadership doesn't start when people agree with you. It starts when people listen. Leadership doesn't require perfection. It requires presence. And presence requires you to know why you're there. This episode is not meant to make you cautious. It's meant to make you clear about why you speak, how you speak, what you protect, what you don't need to perform, because responsibility isn't about silence. It's about stewardship. And stewardship is what separates content from impact. In the next part of this episode, I'm going to share the moment when responsibility stopped being a concept for me personally and became something real. The day I found out I was being laid off, 2 hours before I hit record, and what it meant to show up anyway. Because responsibility doesn't mean waiting until your story is clear. Sometimes it means being present while it's still unfolding. That's where we're going next. I want to take you to a very specific day, not because the details matter for drama, but because the context matters for responsibility. Just a few months after I launched the podcast, mass layoffs swept through corporate America. If you were working in corporate at the time, you remember this season very well. The uncertainty, the rumors, the quiet fear that lived underneath business as usual. Lockheed Martin announced company-wide reductions. We were told that if we were impacted, we would know by the end of February. February passed, March arrived, and the first week of March in Lockheed Martin's company is always performance review week. Bonuses, salary increases, formal evaluations. On a Tuesday at 4 p.m., I logged into what I thought was a routine performance review with my manager because I was getting my bonus and salary increase that Thursday. And if you know Lockheed Martin or a lot of corporate organizations and policies and procedures, you need to have the performance review before the salary hits your paycheck and your paycheck increases and all that stuff. So it had to be that week before Thursday. So I had no reason to think otherwise. This had happened 3 years in a row where on that week that my paycheck was going to increase, I had that performance review. I was doing well. I was performing. I was contributing. And instead, I was told I was being laid off. There was no warning, no explanation, just this sentence. It's not performance-based. It's not personal. It's financial. I was told I'd remain through the end of the month, and that was it. I remember closing my laptop and just sitting there, not crying, not panicking, just still. Because when something ends abruptly, your brain doesn't immediately catch up. You don't instantly know what this means for your life, your identity, your timeline, your sense of stability. And here's the part that makes the story matter for podcasting. At 6 p.m. that same day, 2 hours later, I was scheduled to record a podcast episode. I hadn't told anyone yet, not my friends, not my colleagues, only my parents knew. I was still processing, still in shock, still very angry, still trying to understand what had just happened and transpired. Like, what? And yet the calendar reminder was there, podcast recording. So I showed up, not because I was brave, not because I was strong, but because I had made a commitment. And because somewhere inside me, I knew something important. This phase wasn't about not being okay. It was about being present. The episode started like any other. My guest began sharing his personal journey. At one point, he talked about a layoff he had experienced earlier in his career, how it felt devastating at the time, how looking back, it became a turning point. And he spoke. Something inside me shifted, not because I suddenly had clarity, I did not, but because I realized something quietly powerful. This conversation wasn't theoretical anymore, to me at least. It wasn't a polished lesson, learned story. This was happening in real time to me. And I was able to relate without planning it, without scripting it. I shared that I had found out just hours earlier that I was being laid off. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't make it the center of the episode. I just said the truth. And something interesting happened. That conversation didn't collapse. It didn't turn into sympathy. It deepened. And not because I had answers, but because I was honest. And you can go back and check out that episode. That episode is with guest Mark Troy, and you can hear how that actually transplanted in real time. When we finished recording, both my guest, Mark, and my producer, Ben, who has been with me every single episode that I have recorded, said to me, I can't believe you shared that already. And I understand why they said that. Because we're taught, especially in professional spaces, that you wait. You process privately, you clean up the story, you come back with perspective. But here's what I realized in that moment. Responsibility doesn't mean waiting until your story is polished. It means knowing why you're sharing and who you're sharing it for. I wasn't sharing it for reassurance. I wasn't sharing it for sympathy. I was sharing because I was hosting conversations about growth, resilience, and success. And that meant my role wasn't just about asking good questions. It was to show up honestly, even when the story was still unfolding. That episode still reaches people today. Years later, listeners have told me it helped them through their own layoffs. Not because I told them what to do, not because I offered a 5-step plan, but because I was present in the uncertainty. And presence matters more than polish. There's a belief floating around in podcasting and in personal branding that you should wait until you're ready, until you have clarity, until you've processed, until you've learned the lesson. But readiness isn't always the requirement. Sometimes honesty is. Responsibility doesn't ask you to have questions. It asks you to bring your intention and know that intention. Let me be clear about something important. Responsibility is not oversharing. It's not emotional dumping. It's not using your audience as a processing space. Responsibility is discernment. It's asking, why am I sharing this? Who does this serve? What does this add to the space? That's the difference between vulnerability and exposure. Here's something I've learned from years of listening to listeners. They don't need you to be impressive. They don't need you to be inspirational all the time. They need you to be real in a way that feels safe. Safe doesn't mean sanitize. It means intentional. The day changed how I think about podcasting forever, because I realized something that most people don't need. The mic doesn't amplify confidence. It amplifies alignment. If you're aligned, people feel grounded. If you're performing, people feel unsettled, even if they can't explain why. We live in a world that rewards polish, clean stories, clean arcs, lessons wrapped in bows. Podcasting often offers something different. It offers presence. And presence is powerful precisely because it's imperfect. Presence says, I'm here with you. I don't have this figured out, but I'm not disappearing. That's leadership. Why this matters for you? Well, if you're a host, your responsibility is not to be impressive. It's to be anchoring. If you're a guest, your responsibility is not to perform. It's to be coherent. And coherence doesn't come from having answers. It comes from knowing what belongs in the room and what doesn't. I want to pause here and invite you to reflect. Ask yourself, when have I waited to speak because I thought I needed clarity first? And when might presence have been enough? In the next part of this episode, I want to talk about the other side of responsibility. The moments when responsibility doesn't mean speaking at all. When discernment looks like restraint. When choosing not to share is the most ethical choice you can make. Because responsibility isn't about exposure. It's about stewardship. And that's where we're going next. The other side of responsibility. So far we've talked about responsibility as presence, about showing up honestly, about not waiting until your story is polished, about choosing alignment over performance. But there's another side of responsibility that doesn't get nearly as much attention, and that's restraint. Because responsibility doesn't always mean speaking. Sometimes responsibility means choosing not to. There was a moment that changed how I think about this specifically forever. I was recording an episode with a guest who spoke openly about his mental health journey. He shared deeply about depression, about feeling lost, about a suicide attempt he made earlier in his life. It was one of those conversations that stays with you, and you can go check out that episode. That episode is with guest Eric Rush. On the very same day we recorded that episode, I personally knew a young man, someone close to my life that I saw quite regularly, who was struggling deeply. He had just taken the brave step of asking for help, not after something irreversible happened, before. That detail matters. As the conversation unfolded, I felt that temptation. It would have been easy to relate that personal story. It would have sounded powerful, relevant, connected. It would have made the moment feel emotionally full circle. But something inside me paused. Because even though the stories were connected emotionally, they were not connected ethically. That wasn't my story to tell. And sharing it, even without names, even with good intentions, could have caused harm. So I didn't. That decision didn't come from fear, it came from respect. It taught me something just as important as vulnerability. Not every truth belongs on the mic. Not every connection needs to be voiced. Not every story is yours to carry into the public space. Responsibility is not about silence or exposure, it's about discernment. This is especially hard for people who care deeply, for people who are intuitive, empathetic, story driven, because we feel connections everywhere. We see patterns, we sense meaning, and podcasting rewards storytelling. But just because a story fits doesn't mean it belongs. Here's the line I want you to remember. Impact invites, intrusion takes. Responsibility asks, is this story mine? Does this serve the listeners? Or does it satisfy my need to make meaning out loud? Those are uncomfortable questions, but leadership often is. I want to be very clear about this. Choosing not to share does not mean you're hiding. It does not mean you're being inauthentic, and it doesn't mean you're afraid. Sometimes it means you're honoring the weight of the space. Sometimes silence is protection. Sometimes silence is care. Sometimes silence is the most ethical form of leadership. If you're a host, this matters deeply because when you host a podcast, you are not just speaking. You are stewarding a room. You are responsible for the emotional tone, the safety of the conversation, the continuity of the listener's experience. Hosting is not spotlight, it's anchoring. And anchoring means knowing what the space can hold and what it cannot. If you've ever been a guest on a podcast, it's easy to underestimate your role. You're not setting the questions, you're not shaping the format, you're not managing the flow, but you are stepping into a space where trust already exists. Listeners don't separate the host from the guest. They experience the conversation as one shared moment. Being a guest doesn't make you less responsible. It makes you trusted. And trust doesn't usually disappear dramatically. It erodes quietly. When big topics are handled without care, stories are shared for effect, not intention. Conversations feel reactive instead of grounded. The mic becomes a place for ego instead of service. Listeners may not articulate it, but they feel it. And once trust is gone, no amount of production quality can bring it back. You don't need to be an expert to be responsible. You need to be intentional. Intentional about why you're speaking, what you're reinforcing, what you're normalizing, what you're leaving unsaid. Responsibility isn't about perfection, it's about awareness. I want to pause here and invite you into reflection. Ask yourself, where in my life or work am I equating vulnerability with exposure? And where might responsibility look like restraint instead? Let that question sit. You don't need an answer right now. Here's the paradox most people don't realize. Restraint doesn't weaken your voice, it strengthens it. Because when people trust that you won't overshare, they trust you more when you do speak. Discernment builds credibility, silence builds safety, and safety is what keeps people listening. This is the moment where podcasting stops being content creation and becomes stewardship. You stop asking, will that perform? And start asking, what belongs here? That shift changes everything. In the final part of this episode, I want to give you a framework, something tangible you can carry with you, a way to think about responsibility before the mic, on the mic, and after the mic. Because responsibility doesn't end when the recording stops, and neither does the relationship you've stepped into. And that's where we're going next. Responsibility doesn't end with the mic when the mic turns off. There's something important we haven't said yet. Responsibility doesn't end when you stop recording. It doesn't end when the episode is published. It doesn't end when the numbers come in. It doesn't end when the feedback fades. Because once someone has listened to you, truly listened. A relationship has been formed. A relationship doesn't turn off just because the mic does. This is where podcasting stops being content and becomes leadership. There's a simple framework I return to again and again, not because it's flashy, but because it's grounding. Responsibility before the mic, responsibility on the mic, and responsibility after the mic. And let's walk through each one of these together slowly. Before the mic, intention. Before the mic ever turns on, responsibility begins with intention. Not what am I going to say, but why am I speaking? What do I want the listener to walk away with emotionally, not just intellectually? What perspective am I reinforcing? What am I asking them to carry after the episode ends? Intention doesn't require scripting everything. It requires honesty. Because whatever your intention is, consciously or subconsciously, it shows up. Listeners feel it. On the mic presence. Once the mic is on, like it is right now, responsibility becomes presence. Presence means speaking with care, speaking with clarity, speaking like someone is actually listening, because they are. Presence doesn't mean being perfect. It means being grounded enough to stay with the conversation, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. Presence is what turns talking into trust. After the mic, stewardship. This is the part almost no one talks about. After the mic turns off, responsibility comes to stewardship. Stewardship of the relationship you've entered, the trust you've been given, the space you've created. This shows up in how you talk about the episode afterwards, how you reference people, how you carry the conversation forward, or choose not to. Stewardship asks, do I honor the room I was invited into? Podcasting is not a megaphone, even though podcasting is often treated like a megaphone. Louder, bigger, more. But podcasting isn't amplification. It's relationship. And relationships thrive on trust. Trust is built when people know you're intentional, you're present, you're careful with what they give you. And what does this mean for you? Well, if you're a podcast host, your job is not to impress. It's to anchor, to create a space that feels steady, thoughtful, and intentional. If you guest on podcasts, your job is not to perform. It is to contribute coherently, to bring something aligned, honest, and respectful into a room that already holds trust. If you're thinking about starting a podcast, this episode is not meant to intimidate you at all. It's meant to invite you into leadership. Responsibility is the first decision, but it's not the hardest one. The harder decision comes next. Once you realize your voice carries weight, you're faced with a deeper question. Am I willing to be seen as the person behind the voice? Because podcasting doesn't just amplify ideas, it reveals identity, your beliefs, your values, your confidence, or lack of it. The stories you tell yourself about whether you're ready, qualified, or allowed to take up space. Many people feel the responsibility of being heard and stop there. They hesitate. They wait for permission that never comes. You'll never get the permission. Before we close, I want to invite you into one final moment of reflection. Ask yourself, if someone listened to my next episode on their hardest day, what would I want to give them? Where in my life or work am I underestimating the impact of my voice? And where might responsibility look like restraint right now? You don't need to answer all of that today, but letting yourself ask those questions changes how you show up. If this episode resonated with you, I want to hear from you. Not just the polished version of your story, but the honest one. Your moments of uncertainty, your moments of courage, your moments of authenticity. Let's keep the conversation going. You can reach out to me by going to any of the links that are in the description of this episode. And if you're ready to grow your podcast, your business, or your personal brand through real strategy and real genuine connection, not hustle, not noise, and not performance, then I would love to work together. Because when you lead with connection, you don't just grow your numbers, you grow trust, you grow influence, you grow impact. I'm Olivia Akin, and this is Achieving Success with Olivia Akin. Until next time, stay curious, stay human, and stay connected.